Okay, now this is going to be the last installment of the American Civil War, and it's going to be as fast as I can make it. So, this is the last 2 years of the American Civil War, and 1863 marked a major turning point. And in fact, to be exact, July of 1863 is going to be a major turning point for the Union Army. Honestly, for the first couple years, the Union Army would have an occasional victory, but we were really getting our butts kicked by the South. So, like I said, when we look back at comparing the South and the North, it looked like it would have been an easy victory for the North, but it wasn't. So we're going to start with the Emancipation Proclamation, and this is what Lincoln really wanted to be known for. Though I tend to look at it completely. The Emancipation Proclamation went into effect January 1st, 1861. And the Emancipation Proclamation was Abraham Lincoln's first step in helping free the slaves. I mean, obviously, other than fighting the war, but it's the first, like, written down as a law steps to ending slavery. The problem is that clearly states all enslaved people in states controlled by the Confederacy are free. This eventually leads to the 13th Amendment, which is awesome. But the one thing I want to actually point out is that it only refers to slaves in states controlled by the Confederacy. So that means all the slaves are free in territory that Lincoln and the Union do not control. That would be like I telling you that I get to decide everything that you wear and everything you eat. I don't live in your house. I can't do that. I can write a piece of paper that says that, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen. So Lincoln does have this document, and it does eventually lead to the freeing of slaves in the 13th Amendment in 1865. But one of the things it does do is for those slaves living in that territory who do get wind of this, some of them just do end up leaving the plantations or try to leave the plantations. There are many slaves in the South who never heard of this happening, not until much later on in this American Civil War. They didn't know they were quote unquote free. But it does start by January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation, for anybody in doubt, does show that we are fighting this war to end slavery. It's not just states' rights anymore for people to argue. It's like we are fighting this to end slavery. And so Lincoln was very proud of this, and he took a long time to think about it. But once again, it just frees slaves in territory not controlled by the Union. Not really going to talk about the Battle of Fredericksburg. If we had more time, I would. The Battle of Chancellorsville, not really going to talk about that. There's a little made-for-TV movie. The Battle of Vicksburg, Mississippi. This is actually really important. The Union Army will actually win this in July 1863. The other huge battle the Union Army wins is the Battle of Gettysburg in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in 1863 at the same time. So two major wins for the Union. And all of a sudden, the morale of the Union soldiers, the Northern soldiers, the Yankees, is so much better. People are like, oh my gosh, we're going to do this now. So at Vicksburg, Grant is controlling this long siege at Vicksburg for 6 weeks. Guaranteed he's drinking whiskey. He was known to be a whiskey lover. So whenever he and his troops laid siege to Vicksburg, there would often be some fair amount of drinking going on for him because it was a stressful situation. That's how he dealt with it. So this siege at Vicksburg is like it says, the last CSA stronghold on the Mississippi River. So once you take Vicksburg, you now control the Mississippi River. Grant will utilize the Navy to bring troops in and out, and also to take anybody who was hurt, any of the soldiers that are hurt, out of the fighting, so they could actually go and get help. So the CSA surrenders on July 4th. July 3rd is when Gettysburg ends, and they also surrender. Lee's big mistake. So Lee attacks the North for two reasons. Most of all, like I said, at the very beginning when we talked about this, the South, all they had to do was play a defensive war. They just had to keep the Union Army out. But Lee decides he's going to actually lead an attack. He's going to play offense going into the North. He feels that if he can get a big victory in the North, that he's going to have the United Kingdom and France will join the fight if he wins. Once again, this is kind of like when we had the big victory at the Battle of Saratoga during the American Revolutionary War, and France said, aha, you guys can win, we will back you. He was hoping for his Battle of Saratoga moment. And he wants to get the fight out of the South. He wants to make the North have to deal with the carnage and all of the problems that are happening in the South because all the battles are there. So you have the Battle of Gettysburg, which is July 1st through 3rd. It's actually essentially like a 2.5, 3-day battle. And you have the CSA general is all the way up in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, because he's looking for shoes. It's a really small seminary town. meaning there's a seminary school there. Lee is going to actually come there as well, and so it's going to be Meade, which is a Union leader, and he's going to have about 90,000 troops, and General Robert E. Lee, which is a Southern leader, who's having about 75,000 troops. I'm not going to go into major detail. I mean, literally, they have movies about this, so it's really interesting to learn about. But once again, I'm kind of skipping through it pretty fast. This is parts of what it looks like today. And if you ever drive along the East Coast at all, or like through Virginia and stuff, you can stop and see these battlefields. And these battlefields are still today overlooking like cornfields or fields like this. I know because I've stopped before and I was like, oh, okay, big battle here. So July 3rd, 1863, you're going to have something that's called Pickett's Charge. You have 15,000 Confederate soldiers. Their plan is to run straight into enemy fire, that's Northern fire, for 1 mile. So that's like you carrying your weapons and your guns and running a mile while people are shooting at you. But you're not running away from them, you're running towards them. The reason why they do this is they thought that the Union, which is famous for retreating at times, would then retreat. So what happens is you start off with 15,000 troops and only 5,000 Confederate soldiers make it to the ridge. 75% of Pickett's men are dead after this charge. And you know, honestly, he actually did not want to do it. He was forced and pressured to do this. He's like, why are you asking me to ask my men to run into enemy fire? And once again, to clarify, Pickett is a Southern soldier or a Southern leader. So this is very just infamous in case anybody ever asks you. Pickett's Charge is part of the American Civil War at the Battle of Gettysburg. If we had more time, I'd go into this actually in much more detail. But if you kind of look in the bottom left quadrant of the map, it says Pickett's Charge, and this is where they're actually leading to. The reason why one of the reasons why the Union soldiers were ever able to win this is because they had the advantage of the higher ground. The overall result is that 51,000 people are dead after this battle. It's huge. And if you ever get a chance to go to the East Coast, and if you ever get to go to like Gettysburg, they actually do a really, really great job of having like an interactive display explaining what happened at this battle. And I normally don't go. I'm normally not like that's exciting to go to this battlefield, but it's so well done and just so informative. This would be one of my top ones to recommend. And so you see 23,000 soldiers are dead in the north and 28,000 are dead in the south. One civilian is killed. I believe a bullet went through like the window or something of the home. So the final stages of the war, you have 1 year, 1864, 1865. Grant is going to be the general-in-chief. So he is the leader of all of the Union troops. You have the Army of the Potomac, and their job is to protect Washington, D.C. and start marching towards Richmond, Virginia, which is the southern capital. You also have a guy you might have heard of, William Tecumseh Sherman, who's going to lead this total annihilation throughout the South, and it's going to lead to like the Gone with the Wind, burning of the South, basically a scorched earth policy. Anything that he comes across will be destroyed. We're going to skip the Hampton Roads Conference. Total warfare, like I said, where no target is off limits to a military force. So it didn't matter if you were just a lady with home with her kids. Like, it didn't matter. They were just trying to end the war and making it as painful as possible. And Sherman was the guy who did that for the North. Eventually, they will take Atlanta, and this is where they have the famous Gone with the Wind. It's the burning of Atlanta. The city is evacuated, and it's burnt to the ground. Sherman is also continuing to march to the sea. Then you have the siege of Petersburg. Petersburg is a town just outside of Richmond, Virginia. And so once Petersburg falls, Grant is going to lay siege to Petersburg because that's what he does. A lot of what he does is just waiting it out. Having the willpower, the manpower, the supplies to be able to lay sieges to these places. So he lays siege to Petersburg for 9 months. Eventually, once that town falls and the Union takes control of the railroad, it's over. It's like game over, all done. In fact, President Jefferson Davis, the Southern leader, flees. And this is actually the fall of Richmond. If you can see those, yes, on the ground are all cannonballs. That would have just constantly shelled the area. You can see how things just look bombed out. And this is after you can see that they've started to organize it and put it together and things like that. Lee's last-ditch effort is he planning to meet with Johnston's army by heading west. The Union Army pursues and stops the CSA escape. So he does pursue. So the biggest thing is you have the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia on April 9th. This is Lee shaking hands with Ulysses S. Grant. And Lee agrees to in the war because he realizes anybody else who dies at this point, it's unnecessary. There's no reason to do this. Um, and there is a blonde gentleman in the back by the fireplace, and that is General Armstrong Custer, who will be famous for his losing battle uh, of what they call Custer's Last Stand. So Grant's term of surrender that Lee agreed to, all the rebels had to lay down their weapons and just go home. Like it was just like, just done, go home. People with horses were allowed to keep them to help put in their crops, and the rebels were given 3 days of food. 9 days later, Sherman accepts Johnson's surrender. So these two main generals, Lee and Johnson, the Southern generals, do surrender to Sherman and Grant. But the idea was Grant realized this war is over. Just go home, get food on the table, go see your families. Because once again, remember, the war is over in April. This is getting very close to planting season, and he didn't want people to be starving throughout the winter. The result of the war is 620,000 dead. 90% of, it says head, 90% of dead on assaults weren't, 90% of head-on assaults weren't successful. So that's kind of a considered bad idea. That's why anytime you run into enemy fire, that's obviously not good. You want to have a tactic. You want to have the element of surprise. President Jefferson Davis is captured on May 1865. He spends 2 years in jail. He writes his book and then dies, but people are still kind of see him as like a symbol of Southern pride. And so that is it, the Civil War, April 12th to April 9th, 1865. And you know, not too long after that, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth while watching a play that he didn't even want to see, but he went because his wife really wanted to go and he was trying to make her happy. And that is the American Civil War. That is the